Hello again, friends, and welcome to Madison BookBeat, your listener-sponsored community radio home for Madison authors, topics, book events, and publishers. I'm your host, Stu Levitan. Our guest this hour is one of the brightest new stars in the literary firmament, Danielle Evans, coming back to Madison on Wednesday, virtually at least, for an appearance at the Wisconsin Book Festival to present her new collection, The Office of Historical Corrections. Grief and loss, apologies and corrections, anxiety and forgiveness, women demanding to live full and complex lives, history, performance, race. These are the things which occupy Danielle Evans in the 6 stories and 1 novella which comprise the Office of Historical Corrections, just out from the good people at Riverhead Books and already getting rave reviews. Danielle Evans burst on the scene at age 26 with Before You Suffocate Your Own Fool Self, a collection of 8 short stories she finished while on a fellowship at the University of Wisconsin Institute for Creative Writing. That collection received several awards and made her a National Book Foundation 5 under 35 honoree. In the decades since, she has taught at the aforementioned University of Wisconsin, American University, and the Johns Hopkins University. And in recognition of her artistic excellence and merit, she is also a recipient of a 2020 fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts. It is a real pleasure to welcome to Madison BookBeat, Danielle Evans.
Thank you so much for having me and for that lovely introduction.
And welcome back to Madison, at least virtually.
Thank you. I was hoping that I would make it back to Madison physically, but maybe for the paperback, hopefully things will be more normal then.
We can look forward to that. Thematically, the short stories in this collection seem to be in conversation with each other, and they all set the stage for the novella. Was that cohesion planned from the drop, or did it just click into place all of a sudden?
No, I tell my students, writing is 75% rational decisions you make after the fact and 25% being outsmarted by your own subconscious. So I'd written about half the book before I knew what it was about. I had these stories and I had a sense that they had something in common, but I kept trying to come up with what it was and saying the wrong thing. Like at one point I said, oh, these stories are all in present tense and it's a sort of different way of thinking about story structure. And I said that for a year, and then I looked at them and they weren't all in present tense. And also I was working on something new that wasn't in present tense. So I kept coming up with things like that. But this was supposed to be my back burner project, so I thought I had time to kind of figure out what the link was. And then a couple of things happened all at once, kind of toward the end of the process. In 2018, I wrote, not chronologically the second to last story I wrote, not in the order of the stories in the book, the second to last story, but I wrote the story, Why Won't Women Just Say What They Want, which felt like at that point, the clearest expression of sort of the question of the collection, which was about corrections of the record and revisitations of the past and kind of who a narrative belongs to. And it kind of clicked into place that that was a less subtle version of the question that a lot of the other stories were asking. And then still, I was not sort of smart enough to realize this was also the core question of what I've been trying to work on as a novel for years, or that it was the core question of the sort of what I thought was a new idea. So I put those stories aside thinking they need 1 or 2 more stories to feel complete. I don't know what those stories are yet, and set out to write what I thought was a new version of the novel project. And I realized it was actually my same old novel project, and it was also the same explicit question that the stories in the collection were asking, that it was the same question, again, made more literal, about history, about stories we tell about history. And once I figured that out, I thought, okay, well, this is great because it means I can give it exactly as much room as it needs and kind of no more and no less, that it can have a home in this book that already exists, that it's clearly in conversation with these stories, and that's where it feels like it belongs. So I don't have to try to force it to be longer. I don't have to try to compress it to be short enough for a journal. And so the novella length felt like the right length, and it felt like it was kind of an anchor and an explicit framing of the questions that some of the other stories were asking in more roundabout ways.
And the big thing that's happening in your life is that while you're writing the book, your mother is very sick, and you've actually finished it after she passed. And that's something that you make happen to 2 of your protagonists. Were you aware of how your own reality was seeping into your writing as it was happening, or did you only realize that afterwards?
Yeah, I mean, I think you know that you're writing about grief, but I also think you don't know what an intense grief feels like until you're experiencing it. I started this story, Boys Go to Jupiter, I first drafted in 2013 while my mother was in remission. And I finished it, like I did the last passive edits before it went into a journal, literally the week after she died. It was sort of, it had just gotten accepted, but it was on this kind of tight schedule. And so I was getting copy edits while I was teaching this class that I couldn't not teach because I had to pay for the memorial service. So it was like a very strange week where I'm sort of like between classes on the phone with the editor who had wonderful, thoughtful suggestions. Thank you, Adam. But it was a bizarre time to be editing this story. And I think in some ways that character also felt at a remove from me. And it was maybe the only way that I could sort of anticipate grief or write honestly about grief was to get a little bit far away from it. The more explicit story that is the first story in the collection that feels a little closer to my own experience was, although certainly not at all any literal true conditioning of it, was something I wrote relatively quickly, not that long after my mother died. And it was originally supposed to be an essay. Roxane Gay has a magazine and had invited people to contribute for this issue on the body. And so she invited me to write an essay or a short story. And I thought I was ready to write an essay. I don't know why I ever agreed to write essays, because I'm a fiction writer. And you know, I have a whole career in a form that lets me like evade my feelings, and occasionally people trick me into writing nonfiction instead, and I'm like, what did I do? Why have I agreed to this? But I did agree to it, and I tried and tried, and I could get nowhere on that essay. It just wasn't, it was too soon. I have written a couple of essays since then about my mother, about grief, but I couldn't do it then. So I wrote this short story, and I liked the first version of that short story, and that version exists online. But when I went back to edit it, my editor felt like it could be longer, and I realized that what was missing was kind of the substance of the essay that I'd never written. So in the revision between that sort of initial quick publication of the story and the version of the story as it appears in the collection, what happened was I kind of went back in and tried to write about that experience of grief, about that experience of kind of being in the hospital with somebody who's dying, and that needed to kind of get into the story to give it the full gravity I thought it needed. And as a way into the collection, I think that story pulls together most of the things that come up again, including grief, including loss, including how that kind of reshapes the narrative of the self, but also these sort of questions about racism and kind of everyday racism and structural racism, and also these questions about relationships, and also these questions about kind of passing and performance. And so it felt like the right start to the collection, and I felt like in order to make it the right start to the collection, I did have to go back and make it kind of look at some of the things that it was slightly evading in its first incarnation. But yeah, so it wasn't an intentional thing where I said I'm going to set out to write a book about grief. I think I saw it in a couple of the stories, and I saw it in the structure of a lot of the stories, that the structure of the stories is not necessarily where the active and emotional plot follow the same classic story arc where something happens, there's some sort of active agency or decision made on the part of the character, and then you're reacting to it. The stories feel to me like they're structured around the logic of grief or crisis, right? Where there's something underneath the story, there's something that sort of actually matters, it's giving it some gravity or weight. But a lot of the active plot of the story is about the decisions or choices or actions people take when they're trying to kind of evade or ignore that, or kind of put one foot in front of the other in the face of something they don't have control over. And so that feels like it's very much shaped by grief and by the sort of strangeness of going through a period of dealing with somebody who has a very long illness, which is a kind of strange psychological state where the most hopeful days are also sometimes the hardest days. Those are the days when work has to be done. Those are the days when decisions have to be made. Whereas there is a kind of nihilistic pleasure on the days when there's nothing that can be done, right? When all you can do is be present with the person you love and spend as much time as you have left with them, and there's nothing worth sort of fighting over. There's nothing to sort of prepare for or face or confront, which feels like a tension that carries over into bigger questions about sort of how we imagine the future of the planet, of the country right now. Like what the days when we feel like there's hope or days when we feel like we have a lot of work to do, right? So I think all of that is in the book somewhere, but how intentional it was, you know, that's sort of a gift or curse from my subconscious. I think those realizations came largely after the fact.
Did having a means of translating what you're going through into art help you process your grief in any way?
I don't think so. I mean, I don't know that fiction writing makes good therapy. I often feel that as a professor, even I'm performing the role of world's worst therapist, where I'm like, could you go closer to this thing that hurts? Could you perform it for us better? I feel like you're evading the thing that is trying to kill you. Could you look at it a little closer? I don't know that it's helpful. I mean, I do think it's useful to be able to see, I think, the logic of grief as a story logic, but I don't know that it helps with actual grief. You know, I mean, I think grief is strange, right? I mean, I think one of the odd things about it is that it sneaks up on you at the times when you're happiest, right? That every time something good happens with this book, I want to call my mother, you know, and like nothing about writing it helped prepare me for that.
Yeah. See, this is why I only write histories and journalism. I don't want to get anywhere near fiction and find out how I'm going to process it. A couple of these stories have a real rip from the headline plot. We've got an abusive and self-centered artist making grand gestures of apologies to the women he's hurt. We've got the impact when a photo of a white co-ed in a Confederate flag bikini goes viral. There's domestic violence and violence from white supremacists. Is this because racism and misogyny are such stable factors in American society, or were there specific incidents that sparked these stories?
Yeah, most of the stories that turned out to feel topical were not at all intended to be topical. It just sort of happened to be that that the questions are timeless and they happen to be in the particular news cycle when the story came out. Boys Go to Jupiter, I originally wrote in 2013, which was before a couple of major incidences since then where the Confederate flag and our general kind of investment in Confederate symbols have come to the forefront. But it was actually at the time when I started out to write it, I envisioned it as a campus novel, and I ended up paring it back to a short story, which I think was the right decision. But when I envisioned it as a novel, the kind of second act of it was all based on this controversy that took place on a college campus in the 90s, involving, you know, student newspapers and dorm windows. So like, it feels to some students, I think, who are being sort of assigned the story now, like it's a very contemporary conversation. Or even some of them have sort of thought that it was about something that happened on their campus, but like we've been having these fights for a very long time. And we didn't need Twitter to do it. And so, so yeah, it was interesting. I held on to that story in part to think about how to make sure that it had enough focus on the timeless questions that it wouldn't just feel like it was speaking to a particular moment, and how to sort of tether it to a time period at the start of the decade, which was at least a little bit removed, so it wouldn't feel like the characters themselves were responding to these topical questions. But the larger questions, the reason they're still topical is because they've sort of never gone away. The only exception to that was the story, Why Won't Women Just Say What They Want, which was written for a literary magazine, which had, as a joke, decided it was going to do an issue because there was a sort of problematic framing by a major publication, which had run with the headline, The Fall of Men. And the editor of this magazine was like, I'm going to run an issue that's like the fall of men into volcanoes. And so it was a joke at first. And then a couple of us were like, but could you actually do that maybe? But I at first thought I was going to write a very short story that was going to be kind of tongue in cheek and it was going to be funny. And as often happens when I try to write something funny, I mean, I think it is a little bit funny maybe, but it's also kind of sad. But I think hopefully somewhat complicating that narrative, and that I wanted to kind of lean into this cliche performative space of apology that feels like it's such a familiar kind of narrative that we could probably all at this point tell it in our sleeps, like what somebody sounds like when they're being publicly apologetic for something they've been sort of called out on. And I think that hopefully what happens in that story is that the narrative gets stranger and stranger, both because like there's a volcano, but also because it gradually like gives less space to the man at the center of it, and more space to these women who kind of start out as archetypes and who are all like experiencing different levels of trauma and experiencing it in different ways. And so I don't think it's meant to be like an uncomplicated revenge fantasy, although it is a little bit kind of silly as a story. I also felt like hopefully it got somewhere slightly more serious and asking what happens if we reimagine who the protagonist of a story is, right? I mean, the thing about an apology narrative is that it's always the story of the person apologizing, right? And it may in fact be a very true story of growth and becoming a better person, right? But like, what does you being a better person do for the people who knew you when you weren't? Is if we imagine that some people exist in the world to be the protagonists of their own story of history, and some people exist to teach them lessons, then yeah, it's a story in which like a man hurts a bunch of people and then becomes a better person might have a happy ending, right? If you imagine that the protagonist of the story is one of those other people, it's maybe a more complicated story. And so I wanted to sort of gradually have the story change its own shape to be less familiar and less cliche. And so in that particular story, I was trying to reference this very topical narrative to kind of play with it a little bit.
We're talking with Danielle Evans. Her new collection, The Office of Historical Corrections, is just out from the good people at Riverhead Books. She'll be at the Wisconsin Book Festival this Wednesday at 7 o'clock. Most of the protagonists in the book are Black, but two stories, The Boys from Jupiter about the girl in the Confederate flag bikini, and Anything Could Disappear about a young woman who suddenly and unexpectedly finds herself in the custody of a very young child, are about white women. Do social dynamics create the situation where Black writers are better equipped to write about white culture and characters than white writers are to write about Black culture and characters?
Yeah, I will. Vera, just to clarify, Vera in Anything Could Disappear is mixed race, and so is the child that she takes on. And there's something interesting about that contrast for me, which I hadn't thought about until somebody else asked me a question about those two stories. But I do think that part of the difference between those two stories is that Vera's kind of trying to reinvent herself and escape from things, and it's never quite going to work, right? I think I'm not giving away too much in the story when I say that part of what's looming over that story is the inherent disaster of this plan all along that she has. Whereas what's interesting and maybe a little bit sinister about Claire to me is that she's also a character who's like running, in some ways running more obviously from trauma than Vera is, but she can keep running, right? She's given this space to kind of reinvent herself, and she gradually comes to understand that that's a possibility. And that feels to me like part of an understanding of how privilege works. It's like who gets permanently held accountable for things, and who can say, well, that was then, and this is now, or who can say like, who do I want to be next, and how can I reinvent myself? Who do we give the space of second chances and reinvention? And so I do think that part of, my general answer to the question of like, can I write about this group that's not mine is, I don't know, can you? Like, it's not really a should question or a moral question for me. It's a question of, do you have an understanding or insight into a group that you're not a member of? Do you have enough knowledge of how people talk amongst themselves, right? Have you ever been in a room where you were outnumbered by people in this group and they were having a conversation that wasn't shaped by your presence or wasn't some kind of performance for you? Do you know enough about the structural power dynamics to understand like when a performance is for your benefit? And I think a lot of people don't, right? If all you're seeing is a layer of performance, if all you're seeing is kind of your one friend of color or your one friend of any kind of marginalized background in a space where you get to make the decisions, you might not know enough to get those layers in a character, right? To understand the difference between someone's inner life and someone's external life, to understand the difference between what someone thinks and what someone says. And that is so central to fiction because it's central to character, it's central to narrative possibility, it's central to the capacity to surprise, but it's also part of the structural world of the story, right? It's also part of who has the power to make someone perform and who understands the stakes of that performance and who understands what happens to them if their performance is deemed insufficient. So I guess I'm saying all to say that yes, I do think that in general, writers of color probably understand that world, especially the writers of color who you're likely to encounter and read as a white person, because those writers have generally somehow figured out a way to navigate a world in which most of the power and decision-making is still made by by white people, by white readers, right? So someone who's learned to navigate that world enough to put a book in front of you probably has been paying attention. That doesn't mean that everybody gets it right. That doesn't mean that everybody's great at it. That doesn't mean that everybody's interested in it or has to be. And I also don't think it means that, you know, you can't be better about that as a white writer if you have an understanding of those dynamics, if you have people in your life from the background you're writing about. I'm just always a little skeptical when anyone wants to sort of create in a fictional world people who don't exist in their real life. Like, I think if you're not interested in people in the real world, like there's something a little bit sinister about being interested in them as fictional characters when you can sort of control them and put words in their mouth.
It's funny you just used the word sinister, because I was just about to ask about something in the titular novel, The Office of Historical Corrections, when the first person protagonist says, quote, "Midwest nice is a steady, polite gaslighting that I've found sinister, a forced humility that prevented anyone from speaking up when they'd been diminished or disrespected." Is Cassie speaking for you in that assessment? And how much of that assessment is based on your time in Madison?
Well, now I'm not going to get invited back for the paperback. Thanks a lot. No, I spent a long time in the Midwest. I realized as I was working on this book and realized how many of the stories were set in the Midwest that I'd spent kind of a decade of my adult life there, and not just in Wisconsin. I went to grad school in Iowa. I was, depending on I know there were controversial feelings about where we place Missouri geographically, but my first teaching job was in Missouri. But I did live in Wisconsin twice, and I feel like kind of both times the state saved my life and broke my heart, and is by far the most physically beautiful place I've ever lived. So I don't mean to pick on the state of Wisconsin, but I do think that there is something that felt very. So I didn't have quite as hostile a view of it as Cassie does in the book, but I do feel like there's something disorienting that it took me years to kind of figure out. And it was, I think, a different understanding of the difference between people's interior lives and external lives, like a different way of learning communication. Like, it wasn't the way that I've been taught to communicate. And I realized that, like, sometimes I wasn't hearing what people were saying, and also, like, I wasn't being heard the way that I was used to being heard. Like, the adjustments I'd made in terms of how I expressed myself didn't make sense in that kind of cultural context. So I do think I felt a little bit disoriented by the pattern of communication. And also that and it's not just Wisconsin, but Midwest nice, which sometimes also bleeds into the sort of question of civility, which is a concept we see in academia, a concept we see in politics, a concept we see in a lot of places, does have this silencing impact, right? Civility and even empathy tend to bend in the direction of power. They tend to sort of reward not rocking the boat. They tend to sort of treat actual concrete issues that might influence people's sort of quality of life, or even sometimes life or death, as disagreements that it would be impolite to kind of verbalize or say out loud. And so I do think I agree with Cassie as a kind of larger question. There's something problematic about our investment in civility, and there's something about civility that really is a question of, like, how we can get people with power to agree on who can be sacrificed.
Can a community that prizes civility turn into one that respects, that values respect?
I think so. I mean, and I think that's part of the negotiation we're in as a country, as a culture right now, right? That some of what people complain about as diversity gone amok, or conversations gone too far, or divisiveness, is actually just like us trying to imagine what it might actually look like to have a pluralistic society, right? That some of what people read as tension or division is just because 20 years ago people wouldn't have been in the room. Like 50 years ago they couldn't have spoken without fear of immediate violence. And I don't mean to suggest that we fixed all of those problems at all, but I think that some of what people are experiencing as a kind of problem in the culture is actually growth, or at least an opportunity for growth, right? It's an opportunity for people to participate in democratic society and institutions in ways that are not performative, right? In ways that are not just sort of bringing in somebody who has no institutional power as a protege or a mascot and only hanging on to them as long as they sort of parrot what's already being said. There's a possibility, I think, to have a conversation that actually reimagines what institutions might look like, what politics might look like, what our conversations with each other might look like, if we were honest. But I think it requires a willingness to like actually have conflict. It requires a willingness to sort of not see conflict as a mistake or a sign that things have gone too far, but to see it as an actual like statement of different values. In some cases that just need to sort of exist together. In some cases where like one set of values actually has to win, or we can't have a kind of society in which people can stay alive.
The Office of Historical Corrections, or more formally, the Institute for Public History, is your vision of a government agency charged with protecting the historical record about things like what does Juneteenth really commemorate and who is the Rayburn House office building named after. Where did the idea for such an agency come from, and how did the plot turn from something like that into a detective story / murder mystery about racial terrorism in a sundown town in Wisconsin?
Yeah, for years it was a running joke. I think I was on Metro in DC and overheard some people just having a wildly inaccurate conversation about some kind of historical event. And I got off the train. I don't remember who I was talking to, but I was like, I would pay money. I would pay like 10 extra tax dollars a year to have like a public authority that corrected people. And I was joking, but it was sort of, it became this sort of running joke about like a public works project for historians where they would sort of correct our incorrect ideas. And this was years ago. And so I would sometimes make that joke, but I also recognized right away, and I think especially in recent years, the kind of sinister possibilities of such an agency, right? That like the bizarro world version of the agency that I imagined in this book is maybe this sort of commission on patriotic education that is now like being floated, right? And so I knew all along that like government has the possibility of being a profound site of meaningful investment in our cultural values. It also has the potential to be oppressive and dangerous. And I'm also really interested in that as a negotiation for Black Americans in particular, where because the federal government integrated earlier than some forces, because it stopped actively discriminating against people sooner than private industry did, I think that it's been an interesting kind of site of power for Black people, and an interesting kind of frame for thinking about Black people's relationship to the nation, in which like, in many ways, the government has failed communities of color over and over again. It has also become a profound way of stability and power for individual Black people or Black families, right? That sort of the Black middle class and public service have a fraught historical relationship because of how many jobs in public service were available when other jobs were not. And because of how much of the vitriol directed at the public sector is about race, is about this idea of the sort of lazy, incompetent Black public servant who becomes the face of, all of our attacks on the idea of government. So I wanted to think about both sides of that, right? I wanted to think about government as a thing people actually believe in, as a thing people choose because they believe in civil society, as a thing people choose because they have a kind of positive association with the communities that stable government jobs have made possible. And also government as a place where you're entering an institution that isn't fundamentally designed for you, right? Government as a place where sometimes your authority and your ability to hold on to that authority means like not actually doing the thing you set out to do, or not helping the people you set out to help, or not being able to carry out your actual mission because it's become so sort of watered down or institutionalized or bureaucratized. And I thought that writing about an agency was a good way to think about kind of both sides of that question, about like what it means to be invited into power of some kind, and also how limited that power might be.
And how did that grow into the detective story murder mystery set in Wisconsin about essentially racial terrorism?
I mean, I think that because the agency is focused on the question of history, that always feels like the lurking question of history, right? Is how we hold ourselves accountable or don't. And I don't know that I made a conscious decision that she would go to Wisconsin. I think she just at some point went to Wisconsin and I kind of went with it. So it wasn't an intentional choice, but I did think there was something interesting in both of the stories that are sort of most explicitly about racism and racist symbols. I wanted to move them out of the South, right? I wanted to think about like our nationwide wrestling with race. And so Claire and Boys Go to Jupiter is like nominally Southern, but most of the action takes place on a college campus in Vermont. I wanted to get Cassie out of DC, but I wanted to think about the way that spaces that we don't necessarily associate with actual violent or structural racism are all shaped that way, right? Because everything in this country is shaped that way. And so it was interesting to kind of take her to a slightly unexpected place for the story. And it was interesting for me to think about a way of adding a narrative shape to a question I come back to a lot from Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, that line toward the beginning where he says it is the innocence which constitutes the crime, right? That part of the question of growth or the possibility of growth is whether you can ask people to honestly account for what they've actually done, right? And so the attempt to be better about something while evading what actually happened almost always fails and is kind of doomed to failure. And that's part of the tension that the story is able to dramatize between people who are all fundamentally mostly on the same side in some way, but people who think, okay, well, we just need to somehow correct the record politically neutrally versus people who understand that neutrality to be actually part of the ongoing harm.
We're talking with Danielle Evans. Her new collection, The Office of Historical Corrections, just out from Riverhead Books. She'll be at the Wisconsin Book Festival this Wednesday at 7 o'clock. On the point of racist symbols in Wisconsin and historical corrections, you may remember, I'm not sure if you do, there's a section of Confederate prisoners of war called Confederate Rest at Forest Hill Cemetery on the west side of Madison. And in 2018, there was a major controversy over a large granite grave marker, which technically was not part of the Lost Cause movement, but was paid for by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And one of the things the city council did when it ordered the grave marker be removed was to prevent the Landmarks and Parks Commissions from installing an interpretive sign explaining the history of Confederate Rest and the monument. Would you be inclined to think that there should be such a sign, or that without a real-life Institute for Public History, that the risk of an incorrect sign would outweigh the potential benefits?
I don't know. I mean, it's a fraught question. And I think part of my thinking about monuments came from when I lived in Missouri. I lived near a park where there had been a lynching in like 1905. And after that, most of the sort of Black community left and was kind of pushed out of the city. And so there was a memorial in that park. And it always felt unsettling, and I never wanted to be in that park. And it wasn't that I didn't want there to be a memorial. And the memorial hadn't gone up until the 90s. It had taken all that time to just acknowledge what had happened. And so I was glad for the lack of erasure, but I was also like alarmed every time I was in that park because I was still in a very segregated city, right? I was still like 40 minutes from one of the sort of modern hubs of the KKK. And so I didn't feel necessarily like the monument had made the space safer rather. And I think that's the question really I have about memorial signs, is that how does a person encounter them in the present, right? Like, I think if we encounter that sign in a space where people feel relatively equally protected, then yes, like a historically accurate sign would be great. Like, where in the world are we going to encounter that sign in a space where people feel equally protected is the question. And so, yeah, I don't think that a kind of this is what used to be here and why it was removed sign would be theoretically objectionable. I think the question of like who would write it and what exactly it would say would be subject to our ongoing existing power dynamics. It might be interesting to see the conversation, but I think that it's hard to put up a sign negotiating something that's still in progress. And I think our conversation about race and power and safety is still very much in progress.
Mm-hmm. Well, the council agreed with you. The first person narrator in the story Alcatraz is a biracial young woman trying to help her mother find closure over what had happened to her mother's grandfather. And she has a tattoo that she got at college. It is a close but copyright-free paraphrase of William Faulkner's line that the past is never dead, it's not even past. Is that the character's attitude? Is that your attitude, or both?
Yeah, I mean, I think that character is interesting to me because she's maybe the closest anyone gets to a happy ending in this collection. And I think that part of that getting there is actually, I don't even know that she is as invested in that belief by the end of the story as she is at the beginning, right? Part of the arc of that story is her reconciling what she can fix and what she can't, like what parts of her mother's quest or her own quest, what parts of her family's history belong to her in the present, and what can be let go. And so I don't know that I have like an answer to that question. I think, you know, I wrote a whole book trying to answer that question and I still don't have the answer to that question. But I think that she's a person who maybe more so than the other characters is able to get to some level of peace with it. And it's partly because she's able to draw a boundary where she says, okay, this part of the past isn't still happening anymore. This part of the past I am done with. But she still has that tattoo. So.
If you were going to get a literary tattoo, you may have one already, but if you're going to get a literary tattoo, what would it say, or at least who would it be from?
Oh, I don't know. You know, I used to want a tattoo, and then I read at some point that a tattoo is actually, it's not a scar. It's a wound that never heals. Like it's a long-term, I don't know, somehow that just psychologically messed with me to the point where I was like, I don't want that. So then I stopped thinking about imaginary tattoos that I would get. Yeah, I think it's weird to put someone else's words on your body. I think I would probably have to, it'd probably be a line of my own writing, which I wouldn't do because then it would be narcissistic, but I feel like it would be odd to mark yourself with somebody else's language.
Yeah, that's what epigrams are for. You can put the words that you want to honor at the front of your books. And why did you choose the two epigrams that you did in this book?
Yeah, I thought they both spoke in interesting ways to the sort of wrestling with history, especially to wrestling with history as a Black American. So they're from Lucille Clifton and James Baldwin. And Baldwin's is also about the question of the sort of way that stories about history can make us dishonest, whether about personal or national history. So I thought it spoke to both of the sort of levels of the question in the book. And Clifton's is from the poem where I think that part of what that poem does for me is talk about inheritance and the sort of question of legacy, right? This past was waiting for me when I came, which is a very literal way of thinking about like what we inherit, and also a question of, that speaks to that kind of structural question of agency and how much agency we have or don't have in various points in time, right? That question of like, what part of the story is up to me? What part of the story is shaped by my actions? And what part of the story is kind of hovering there no matter what I do?
You mentioned a moment ago that few, if any, of the characters really have happy endings. And it seems to me that most, if not all, the protagonists are damaged in some way. One can't remember walking around without suspecting that something inside of her wanted her dead. Another doesn't know if she's managed anything good or permanent or healing. Another's afraid of her own house. Several of them have recurring nightmares. Do characters have to be damaged to be interesting?
I mean, I don't know anyone who isn't damaged, so I don't know how to answer that question. Like I don't know how I would imagine a person, period, who wasn't on some level damaged. I think that maybe what feels most consistent across these narrators is a kind of anxiety, right? I think that that's also part of the sign of the grief and crisis logic of this book, is that anxiety has a way of being both a survival mechanism and something that sometimes makes survival more difficult, right? I think that it's been an interesting decade for people who have a tendency to catastrophize, because it has a way of being like, if I were going to go with the most hysterical voices of the last decade, or I was going to go with the people who said, calm down, it's going to be okay, I would be better off in many cases having gone with the catastrophizing people, right? If I were trying to prepare for what was actually going to come next. And so I think that that's a kind of larger scale problem of the way you make a life if your life is prone to crisis, if you're right to be afraid that people won't treat you well, you learn to be on guard for that. And that guardedness is a survival mechanism. And that guardedness is also a thing that sometimes you pay for when you sort of can't believe that something isn't about to go wrong, right? Or when you sort of create the catastrophe yourself because you're so accustomed to catastrophe. And so I do think that there is a kind of anxiety logic at play in a lot of the characters, but I also think that that anxiety logic is, it feels to me generational. It feels to me like something that a lot of millennial people experience in terms of like the world in which they are becoming adults, not being at all the world in which they were prepared for. And the people who keep saying like, oh, this is a sort of normal, you know, ebb and flow of things, actually being wrong a lot, right? I think it's an anxiety that is inherited if you are a person of color in this country, if you are a Black person in this country, from kind of generations of being prepared for things to go wrong, being raised to like be on guard for like when they were going to come for your civil rights. And so I think it's a gendered anxiety of being raised to navigate the world for like looking at where the threat might come from, right? And so I do think that I guess I'm saying I don't know that that's damage, right? Or I think the alternative to that, maybe it's damage, but the alternative to that would be being dead.
Yeah. A 66-year-old white guy and a 36-year-old Black woman are going to see the world differently and perceive threat levels and what's normal differently because of what our lives are.
Yeah, and I mean, and I think that, I don't mean to say that some of it isn't, I don't mean to suggest that everyone responds to the same structural forces in the same way. I mean, I think that like, well, what the characters do with that particular anxiety varies wildly from story to story. And in some cases, people do get to a point where they're able to sort of calm down and exist in the present. But I also think that it's interesting to think about the sort of structural anxiety of the stories, and also interesting to think about anxiety as damage, and also as survival, and also as a way of knowing that people care about you, right? I think if you feel constantly at harm, then people's anticipation of the bad things that might happen to you has a way of feeling like affection, and that plays into some of the relationships in the stories in interesting ways. So I'm interested in sort of different things people do with that same feeling.
When you came back to Madison in 2014 as an assistant professor at the UW, you told Rob Thomas of the Capital Times you were working on a novel set in Washington about the performative aspect of race and politics. And according to the interview, you were apparently enjoying the process of writing the novel. How did this novella and collection of stories come to supersede that project?
Yeah, and I think in some ways it is the same project. I just didn't know it at the time. I mean, it's a variation of the project, but you know, I was working on the novel. I'd come here with a draft of the novel, and I spent a year and a half getting to a second draft that I felt solved the obvious problems of the first draft, and I thought we were pretty close to that novel being done. I gave it to my editor, and I started to work on some like smaller questions that came out of that conversation. And I think as more time passed, she had some bigger questions, I had some bigger questions. And so, you know, she asked, can we rethink something at the core of this? And I just said no, like I couldn't rethink it again. At that point, I was, I think partly at a certain point you get so far from a project that you're no longer the person who started it. And so you can try very hard to be the writer you were, which can feel like reverse growth, or you can be the writer you are now. And it felt like it made more sense at that point for me to, I thought start over. I thought start something new, although it turned out not to be that new after all. But I also think that novel had kind of encountered just a time problem that the novella solved, which is that I am interested in politics as a kind of theater, that has real stakes. You know, I'm interested in both the kind of the way that politics is our ongoing decision about who as a culture we think deserves to live and who we think deserves to die. But also that it's this sort of weird space of acting, right? And that acting becomes more and more layered if you have any kind of cultural baggage or way of being marked, that it's like a sort of complicated negotiation with power. So I wanted to write about that without writing about actual politicians, right? I didn't want to write something that felt super topical. I didn't want to write something that felt like it was like just a sort of, I don't know, like a fictionalized biography of Barack Obama or something. You know, I wanted to write something that felt like I'd invented these characters as ways of thinking about these questions. But as we got further and further from, the book was set in 2010, and as we got further and further from 2010, I don't know, this fictional version of the past just felt like it had less and less to say to the present, that I couldn't imagine the present moment without the actual shape of that period of time having gone the way that it did. And I didn't want to do something that felt completely speculative. So I just felt like I couldn't solve the core framing problem of the book anymore. And I also, I think, hadn't realized how much of the other kinds of questions of the book, the sort of family history and legacy, which were also always a part of that novel, were already in the short stories that I'd written. You know, I had this idea that some of these stories would probably never be published as stories, because really what they were was a variation on what I was writing about in the novel. And letting go of that novel let me like appreciate the work those stories were doing as stories, and let me sort of see the collection as the deconstructed version of the book that I was writing all along. And then when I set out to write this sort of new project, it turned out not to be so new after all. It was, I had sort of solved the time problem by setting it in a kind of nebulous future and making it sort of speculative enough that it, you know, I feel like when that year comes, people aren't going to be like, oh, but we don't have this agency, so this book is no longer accurate. Like, we're not going to have the agency, obviously. So it felt like it was far enough removed from realism to let me play with those questions in a way that still felt relevant to questions that we are asking now and will be asking in 5 years, even though there won't be, you know, an imaginary agency going around fact-checking people. And I also felt like it solved the other problem of the book, which was that people kept telling me that the main character being a historian having trouble writing a book was not very interesting. And I was like, what are you talking about? This is like a fascinating problem. But it is apparently only a fascinating problem for academics, and everyone else doesn't understand the stakes of this question. So I gave her a real job, or a real narrative task, and made her both a historian and a kind of detective. And that, and then once I realized that it was just a version of that project with the problem solved, I went back and pulled in some of the writing that was in that original draft, to both the novella and in a couple places to some of the stories. And so I was able to understand it as the same character, the same question, but a project that felt more structurally sound, and wasn't trying to kind of get trapped in what felt like a math problem about just like, I couldn't move the book into the future because people had to be the right ages, but I couldn't like write about the past in a way that felt interesting to me in the fictionalized form that I'd chosen to.
Well, among the people you thank in the acknowledgements are the people at Riverhead Books who did not freak out when you told them that this was going to be another collection with a novella. Does producing two wildly successful collections of stories increase or alleviate the pressure to finally write that novel? Or not that novel, but to write a novel?
Well, I have a novel still under contract with them. So officially, yes, I'm writing a novel now. We'll see what book they actually get. And I think that, you know, ultimately what they want is a good book, and they've been very supportive of both of my collections. So I do think that I'm writing a novel this time. We'll see what happens.
Other than the novella, the stories in this book all appeared in various publications and anthologies. After a piece has been published in the Sewanee Review or included in Best American Short Stories, what drives you to go back and make changes? And what changes did you make between the initial publication and this collection?
Yeah, it varied wildly. Those two stories that were in Best American, I didn't change that much. Partly because I'd had a chance at that point, because they had been taught in schools, I've been reading them to audiences for a while. I had a chance to talk to readers and engage questions, and I felt like the stories were mostly doing what I wanted them to do. So it's not that I felt super precious about them. You know, if I felt like, oh, I got something wrong, I would have tried to fix it. But I felt like the stories were doing about what I wanted them to do in the world. And I realized belatedly that in my first book, there was a story that was in Best American and that I edited somewhat. I didn't make major changes, but I added some scenes. I did some sentence level work. And it was actually kind of confusing to have both versions of that story exist in the world, as both versions of the story continue to be assigned, that I'd be talking to classes where like half of the students had read one version and half had read another, just depending on like what they had access to, or where I was reading from a version of the story that was in the book, but the students had read the one that was in Best American. And so I felt like if I were going to make changes, I needed to have like really good answers to the question of like, why did I make that change? And in most cases, I didn't. I think just in line editing, because different editors have different questions, we did a couple of edits for clarity. And I changed in Richard Brett gave Battle in Vain. There was an appendectomy scar, and it was right after the first book, which also referenced an appendectomy, and it was too many appendectomies. So it was like things like that, just like the books being in conversation, that got changed. In a later story, I changed one character's name because I realized I had two Charlies back to back that I hadn't thought about until I saw the stories together. They were both, the Charlie in Alcatraz was more important than the Charlie in the original Charlie in Anything Can Disappear. So there was, sometimes it's just small things like that, looking at things in conversation. The bigger changes I made were stories that were either relatively recent and I felt like had more room to explore, or stories that I'd written a long time ago and felt like I needed to kind of come back to as the writer I am now. So the first story in the book, Happily Ever After, got some, as we talked about earlier, kind of somewhat significant rewrite in that I wanted to kind of go back into some of the places of grief that felt a little bit not glossed over, but that there was more room to actually get the sort of hurt of that on the page. And so that story just kind of got slowed down some. And Alcatraz, I went back to partly to kind of think about the framing. That was actually a story that I wrote before my first collection was published. And it was also the only story I've ever given anyone veto power over, because there was some, it's a work of fiction, but there was some references to actual family history. And so I gave it to my mother and I said, if you don't want this published, I will not publish it. And she actually really liked the story, and it was published in a journal in 2010, and she was happy to see it there. But it felt strange to go back to it without her there. And so I had a kind of negotiation with that story between how much I wanted to change based on kind of looking back at it as a different and older writer, and how much of the story I felt like I could change because I'd made a promise. And so part of that negotiation was leaning into the frame where there was always a retrospective voice, but I made that retrospective voice a little bit more retrospective to kind of try to preserve the original story, but also give some room to step out of it and look back at it. And then the novella went through like a lot of revision because it was a rough draft, and then I had to pull in things from the novel. So, between, of course, it hadn't been previously published, but that process was kind of an intense reimagining from the first draft to the second draft, and then a kind of cleaning up in the third and fourth drafts. So yeah, I guess something else to say that like story to story, it was a wildly different process. The stories that had the most public life, for the most part, didn't dramatically change, although there is this weird thing where some of the stories were originally published online and the printed versions are now wildly different than the online versions because some of those were newer work. So yeah, we'll see what happens.
Well, whatever changes you made or didn't made, they all turned out great, because it is a wildly wonderful book to read. I'm just so happy that the book festival is bringing you here this Wednesday. This is all the time we have with Danielle Evans. Again, the book is The Office of Historical Correction. She'll be at the Wisconsin Book Festival in a crowdcast presentation this Wednesday at 7 o'clock. For more information, wisconsinbookfestival.org. Next week on Madison BookBeat, a reprise of our conversation from this past July with another book festival attraction, Sarah M. Broom, in conversation about her great book, The Yellow House. Until then, on behalf of News and Public Affairs Director Shali Pittman, producer engineer Rochelle Wilson, and all of us here at Madison BookBeat, I'm Stu Levitan. Thank you for joining us. And now, as Ben Sidran plays us out with a little bit of Little Sherry, please stay tuned for Alex Wilding White and All Around Jazz. You're listening to WORT 89.9 FM Madison, listener-sponsored community radio. And we're out.